Good morning, and I'm John Henderson, and welcome to our series of going through the Bible, beginning with Genesis through Revelation, where we are exploring in the Bible the elements of discipleship that Jesus was so adamantly a part of in his own ministry. Remember, Jesus began his 3-year ministry with doing what? The calling of 12 disciples for him to teach and to follow him. Think about that just a moment. As you explore then the remainder of his ministry, which we have a lot in the Gospels, and then passages of his own teachings quoted throughout the letters by the apostles throughout the New Testament. In those, Jesus emphasized his original disciples. If you notice how many times he would do something and then explain what he had done to his disciples, or explain what had happened to the disciples for their own spiritual growth. Notice also when he was speaking to even large crowds of people teaching, he was teaching them elements of discipleship, such as love of God, trust, obedience, the kinds of things that are necessary in a commitment to decide to follow him as a disciple. And finally, on that point, remember that in Matthew, at the end of Jesus' life, he gave the Great Commission to his now hundreds of disciples. And what was that commission? Go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations. That's why I think that our emphasis on finding the elements of discipleship in the Bible is important for this endeavor, this undertaking that we're doing. We are now at the book of Joshua. If you got Joshua up, we are at the book of Joshua, and Moses has died. Moses was the first actual spiritual leader of what will become the Judeo-Christian faith. And he has led the liberation of the children, the descendants of Abraham, out of 400-year bondage in Egypt to the bottom of Mount Sinai, the base of it, where he begins to enlarge the elements of faith that had been available heretofore, which had only been the promise to Abraham, that he would give them the promised land and that he would do great things with his descendants. That was sort of a very bare framework. Now, elements of substance throughout Moses' 40 years have been constantly added to that, and even the Bible is beginning with Moses writing the first 5 books of the Old Testament, thus the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the books of Moses. Now Moses has died, and Joshua, who has been his assistant basically for 40 years. Joshua was one of the very few who actually was a young adult when they were led out of Egypt by Moses. Joshua has been Moses' constant companion and assistant throughout this time. It's mentioned numerous times up until the point where we have come. Moses died in about 1400 BC, and Joshua died about 1375 BC. Let's have a look at Joshua. Joshua was about 42 years old at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. There's 40 years now that they have wandered in the wilderness as this purification of a spiritually immature and unknowing generations have died off. And we have people who have been with Moses under the guidance of God for virtually all of their lives, a very different people. So that makes, as the people have come to the place where they're about to enter the promised land, and Joshua has been picked by God, commissioned by Moses before his death, Joshua is about 82 years old. And when he died, 25 years later, he was about 110 years old. From the time of the Exodus, he was, as I said, a very close associate of Moses. Why that is important to our emphasis and inquiry is, think about it. Joshua is the first example that we can concretely point to as a disciple who was created by another disciple. Moses. Moses grew in his own spiritual leadership and his own spiritual faith under the direct supervision of God with an incredible personal contact. And he had the task of imbuing others with the same sorts of loyalty, trust, obedience, love of God, knowing the commandments of God, knowing the character of God. All of these things wrapped up into the elements of discipleship. And he's focused a very lot of that effort on Joshua, his young assistant. Moses' teaching of Joshua and Joshua's attention to what he was being taught made him more and more like Moses, a disciple of the Lord. And now he has come to be the leader in Moses' place of the Israelites. Joshua was with Moses, if you will recall, on Moses' ascension up into the clouds and the fire of the top of Mount Sinai. Remember, he picked Joshua to go with him up onto the mountain instead of Aaron, which is an interesting little side because it was during that instance that the sordid element of the golden calf being worshipped came to be. And remember, Aaron got a pretty bad rap for that because Aaron, Moses' big brother, was there and he wasn't able to stop all of that. In fact, looked like he participated or made it a little, enabled it a little bit. All of that got worked through. But because Joshua was with Moses, he was not involved whatsoever with the gold calf incident. There's other elements of this teaching by Moses and learning by Joshua to be a disciple that are important here too. Since Joshua was with Moses so much, even though the Bible doesn't comment on it, common sense would tell you that Joshua was with Moses and possibly an integral part of the actual writing of the first 5 books of the Bible. There are a number of scholarly articles and books that are written on this point, that Joshua could not have been with the author of such an epic volume of books based on theology, the relationship with God of these people, and not have been somehow involved in the actual writing. And one of the things pointed to on that point is that the book of Joshua is the 6th book of the Bible following Moses' 5 books. And there are many elements in the writing style of the book of Joshua that are very similar to the writing style of the first 5 books. Now, obviously, Moses didn't write the book of Joshua because all of the events occurred after his death that are in Joshua. But Joshua is attributed as having written, if not all of the book of Joshua, except the part about his own death at the very end, that he would have been very intricately involved with that. It's an interesting thing to take note of. He was chosen then by Moses and by God to be the new leader. And he was chosen because the more he trusted Moses and saw how Moses trusted God, the more he trusted God, and the more Moses and God trusted him. Now Moses has died at the age of 120. And if you could put up map A, Mallory. Now we find that we have several million Israelites, all of whom who have followed Moses for 40 years, are at the edge of the promised land. But now, even though they came from the south of the promised land, down from where Mount Sinai is, almost directly south of Canaan or the promised land, they have skirted, as you'll see on the map, around to right apart where the Jordan River is close to flowing into the Dead Sea. On your map, you will see circled in red Jericho. Jericho is directly across the Jordan from where the Israelites are now camped. Now, on that map, if you look closely because it's small, you'll see Mount Nebo. That is where Moses died. And they've basically been there for about a month or so since Moses' death, mourning him, and Joshua taking over in the leadership capacity. Remember also that by this point, where they are about to formally enter the promised land, remember that they have already conquered a large portion of the land that is west of the Jordan, which with God's permission is annexed to the promised land and has been given to 3 of the tribes as their portion. That has already been done, and most of that area that's been done by this point you will see shaded in yellow on your map. So God has appointed Joshua to take Moses' place. But we have something to notice about Joshua that's important. First of all, from the very beginning, God forms essentially the same kind of personal relationship with Joshua that he had with Moses. But there's a difference here that's important for us to consider. Remember when Moses started his relationship with God at the burning bush? Remember, Moses didn't know God, didn't have any history of any relationship of faith with God. In fact, as I have puzzled over and been so amazed by that famous question that I can't mention enough, when God was telling Moses what he was to tell the people, and Moses says, "And who am I to tell them that you are?" That shows how far we have come in just a generation, so to speak. Because Joshua is at that exact same place in his own personal spiritual development that Moses was at the burning bush, except Joshua now knows all about the plagues, the deliverance, the 10 Commandments, how the 10 Commandments came down, the forming of the tabernacle, the transformation of the people of Israel from a non-spiritual people into a much more advanced spiritually and trying to be obedient people. That's because, remember, just like in the Bible, all of the history, which the Bible shows, of God's revelations about himself, which began with Adam, but remember, they are increasing dramatically all through the Bible, where more and more and more is known as we move through the events and the powerful personalities, both successful and unsuccessful in spiritual growth toward God. When we look at all of this, we see that that progression is already paying great dividends with Joshua, because he knows so much more about God than Moses did as he takes leadership. There's another little difference with Joshua than for Moses too. God is doing all the work with the plagues and the deliverance of the 10 Commandments, and all of these things. Largely the acts and events are coming directly from God. Now they are about to enter the promised land, and one of the things at the very beginning of his relationship with Joshua, if you could put up the illustration, one of the very first things that God tells Joshua as he's about to lead the Israelites into the very promised land he had promised Abraham for his descendants. He tells them, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall give the people possession of the land I swore to their fathers to give them." Notice that he has now added that he is acting, but he is going to act through Joshua and the chosen people to accomplish his purpose, rather than just doing all of it himself. In other words, Joshua, I'm still in charge. I'm doing it, but I'm going to do it through you. And guess what Joshua then does? Just like all disciples, how they learn and how they teach, Joshua then turns and tells to all of the Israelite chosen people the exact same thing. You are going to go into the promised land, and God is going to give us possession, but you've got to be strong. You've got to be courageous. You've got to do what he says. And guess what? It's now been 3,500 years later, and that message has not changed one bit. Thank you.